The woman they laughed at didn't flinch. She stood at the edge of Redstone Creek's main street with a single carpetbag and mud on her boots, and the first thing she heard, before a hello, before a how do you do, was laughter. It came from the group of women clustered outside Haverford's dry goods store. One of them, a sharp-faced woman in a pressed blue dress, looked Mabel Hart up and down the way a person examines something they found stuck to the bottom of their shoe. "Lord have mercy," the woman said, loud enough for half the street to hear. "That's the mail-order bride? She'll break the poor man's horse just climbing into the saddle." The laughter spread like a brush fire. Mabel didn't look away. She didn't cry. She just stood there and let the sound wash over her, the way she had let so many things wash over her in 31 years of living her father's disappointment, her sister's pity, the slow understanding that the world had already decided what she was worth before she ever opened her mouth. But she had come too far to turn around. And she had learned a long time ago that the people laughing the loudest were rarely the ones still standing at the end. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to the channel and follow Mabel's journey all the way through. Hit like, leave a comment with the city or country you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. Every name in that comment section is a reminder that some stories need to be told. The stage had dropped her in Redstone Creek at 2:30 on a Thursday, and nobody had come to meet her. That wasn't a surprise. Colton Rourke had made no promises about meeting her personally. His letter, 3 pages, written in a cramped, practical hand, had said only that arrangements had been made at the hotel for one night, and that he would collect her Friday morning. It was a letter that contained no poetry and no flattery, and that was the reason Mabel had answered it. She had received other letters. One man had described her as a fine, sturdy woman, the way he might describe a fence post. Another had sent a daguerreotype of himself, and nothing else, as though his face was sufficient argument. Colton's letter had been different. He'd written about the ranch, its size, its problems, the brutal winters, the cattle that tested a person's patience down to the last nerve. And then he had written one sentence that she had read 4 times before folding the letter away. "I am not looking for someone to decorate the place. I am looking for someone who will still be standing when things get hard." She had written back the same week. Now she stood in the street and listened to women laugh at her, and she thought about that sentence, and she picked up her carpetbag and walked to the hotel without a word to any of them. The hotel clerk gave her a room key and the particular look of a man who was working very hard not to say something he was thinking. The room was small and clean, with a window that overlooked the main street. She set her bag on the bed and stood at that window for a long time, watching the town move below her. Redstone Creek was not a beautiful town. It was functional, a collection of buildings that had been built to withstand weather rather than to impress anyone. The livery sat at the far end of the street, and the smell of it reached her even through the glass. 2 saloons faced each other across the road, as though in some permanent standoff. A church sat on a slight rise to the east, its white paint already going gray at the edges. The women from the dry goods store had dispersed, but she had catalogued their faces. The sharp-faced one in the blue dress was the one to watch. Women like that didn't stop at one laugh. Women like that kept going until they found something that actually hurt. Mabel had grown up with women like that. She knew the pattern. She unpacked her bag slowly, hanging her 2 good dresses in the narrow wardrobe, setting her hairbrush and her mother's small hand mirror on the dresser. She looked at herself in that mirror for a moment. 31 years old, dark hair that wouldn't quite behave, a face that wasn't remarkable in any particular direction, and a body that had always been exactly what it was, solid, capable, built for work rather than admiration. She had stopped being angry about it somewhere around the age of 22. What she hadn't stopped doing was noticing the cost. She ate dinner alone in the hotel dining room, ordered the beef stew because it was hot, and she was cold from the stage, and tried to ignore the way the room adjusted itself, around her presence conversations dropping to murmurs, glances cutting sideways. A man at the table near the window said something to the woman across from him. The woman covered her mouth, and Mabel looked directly at them until they looked away first. That was the only weapon she had ever really had, the willingness to hold the gaze longer than the other person could stand. She slept badly. The mattress had opinions about where she could and couldn't settle, and the street outside never fully quieted. Someone was playing a fiddle in one of the saloons, something fast and frantic that seemed to have no intention of ending. She lay in the dark and thought about what she was doing. She was 31 years old. She had kept house for her father for 9 years after her mother died, while her 2 younger sisters married and left. She had watched her father's farm go from struggling to failing to something too hollow to keep living in. When he died 2 winters ago, there had been debts instead of an inheritance, and a house that went to the bank, and 2 sisters with husbands who had very politely made clear that there was not quite room for her in their lives. She had taken a position as a housekeeper for a widower in Abilene. She had done the job well. The widower had eventually informed her that he intended to remarry and that her services would no longer be required, and that had been that. She had answered Colton Rourke's letter with nothing to lose and everything to gain, and lying in a creaking hotel bed in Redstone Creek, she decided that she was going to stop treating that like a shameful thing. She was choosing. That was different from being chosen. She was going to keep remembering that. Friday morning was gray and cold. The sky pressed flat and low over the mountains to the north. She dressed in her better of the 2 dresses, dark green wool, not new but not worn out, and came downstairs to find Colton Rourke already waiting in the hotel lobby. She recognized him from the small photograph he'd sent, though the photograph had not fully communicated the scale of the man. He was tall and broad across the shoulders in the way of someone who hadn't built himself up deliberately, but had simply been worked into that shape by years of doing hard things. He was maybe 35, with dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that looked like it had been through weather, not ruined by it, but marked. There were lines around his eyes from squinting into sun and wind, and his jaw had the particular set of a man who did not waste energy on expressions he didn't mean. He was watching the door when she came down the stairs, and he looked at her directly. And he did not smile, but he also did not do the other thing, the thing she had half expected, the fractional hesitation, the barely concealed recalibration. He just looked at her the way a person looks at someone they were expecting to meet. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Rourke," she said. He offered his hand for a handshake, which was not the standard greeting, and she shook it, which was not the standard response, and neither of them commented on this. "Did you sleep?" he asked. "Some," she said. "The fiddle player at the Elkhorn stops around 3, he said. "Didn't used to bother me until someone told me that, and then I started noticing it." It was such an ordinary thing to say that she almost didn't know what to do with it. "I'll collect your bag," he said. "I can manage it." "I know you can," he said. "I'm offering to carry it, not suggesting you can't." She let him take the bag. They walked out into the gray morning, and that was when it started. She heard it before she fully understood what she was hearing, a sound that was too deliberate to be casual, rising from the small cluster of people already out on the main street. The sharp-faced woman from yesterday was there again with 2 others, and the sound they were making was the particular sound of people who want to be heard without appearing to be trying. "There he is," one of the women said. "Colton Rourke, proudest fool in Redstone Creek." Colton kept walking. His jaw tightened slightly. She caught that, but he kept walking. "Couldn't find a real woman, Rourke?" Another voice, male this time, coming from a man leaning against the post outside the barber shop. Big man, well-dressed for a weekday morning, which meant he had money or wanted people to think he did. He had a broad, flat face and the smile of someone who was very used to his own jokes landing. "Had to order one in from a catalog?" Colton stopped. Mabel felt the shift in him before she saw it, the slight change in how he was holding himself, the way the stillness went from neutral to something with an edge. "Morning, Mercer," Colton said. So that was Wade Mercer. She stored that name. "That's a lot of woman you've got there," Mercer said. The women near the dry goods store laughed. Down the street, 2 men outside the livery had turned to watch. "Hope your ranch can handle the extra weight." It was a crude, stupid thing to say, and it was meant to be crude and stupid. It was meant to land the way a thrown rock lands, hard and graceless and undeniable. Mabel had a choice in that moment. She could look at the ground. She could pretend not to have heard. She could let Colton handle it, which would make her the thing Mercer was suggesting she was a problem for another person to manage. She looked directly at Wade Mercer, and she waited until she was sure he was looking back at her. "I'm sorry," she said pleasantly. "And you are?" Mercer blinked. He hadn't expected her to speak. "Wade Mercer," he said after a moment. "I own the Double M, biggest spread in this valley." She said, in the tone of someone who has filed a piece of information away as not particularly interesting. Then she turned to Colton. "Shall we?" She heard the silence behind them as they walked, and it was a more satisfying sound than anything Mercer could have followed up with. Colton's wagon was tied at the end of the street. He loaded her bag without comment. They climbed up, and he turned the horses, and they drove out of Redstone Creek with half the town watching from storefronts and street corners. After about a mile, Colton said, "You handled that well." "I've met men like him," she said. "He's not going to stop." "I know. He's been trying to push me off my land for 2 years," Colton said. He said it the way he seemed to say most things directly, without working up to it. "He wants my grazing rights and my access to the creek that runs through the north pasture. He's tried buying me out. He's tried filing claims against me. He keeps moving to the next thing when the last thing doesn't work. What does that have to do with me? Nothing, directly. But he'll use anything he can. A beat. I wanted you to know that going in." She looked at the road ahead, at the mountains coming up gray and enormous in the distance. "I appreciate that," she said. "I also want to say something else," he said. She waited. "I wrote in my letter that I wanted someone who'd still be standing when things got hard. I meant that, but I also know that what Mercer said back there was." He stopped. Tried again. "A man says something like that about a woman in his company, that's a reflection on him, not on her. I want you to know I understand that." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "I've been looked at the way that man looked at me since I was 14 years old. I've had more time to make peace with it than you might think." A pause. "But I appreciate you saying so." They drove the rest of the way to the ranch, in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, which struck her as a reasonable beginning. The ranch itself was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something modest, a working man's property, functional and a little rough. What she found was something that had started out modest and been built up by stubbornness over years. A solid house, a large barn, 2 bunkhouses for the hands, a fence line that ran to the tree line and back. It needed work in places. A section of fence on the east side had been recently repaired badly, and the kitchen garden had been let go, but the bones of it were sound. She walked through the house while Colton waited in the doorway, because he seemed to understand that a person needed to see space with their own eyes before they could understand what they were dealing with. Kitchens was large, which was good. The stove was iron, and had seen better days but was serviceable. There was a root cellar she found through a door at the back, half-stocked, which she immediately began cataloging in her head. The front room had a fireplace that drew well, she could tell by the clean way the ashes lay. There were 2 bedrooms at the back of the house. She came back to the front door. 2 separate rooms, she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said. "Whatever arrangement, that's fine," she said. "That's sensible," he nodded. "The east fence," she said. "The repair on the near section. Who did that?" Something shifted in his expression. "One of my hands. Holt, he's young, he used green wood. It'll warp in the wet, and the whole section will need doing again by spring." She looked at him evenly. "I grew up on a farm. I know what I'm looking at." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll have him redo it." "Show me where the supply records are," she said, "and then I'd like to meet the horses." She heard him exhale, not quite a laugh, but something in that direction. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They were married 2 days later, in the parlor of the house, with the circuit judge officiating and 2 of Colton's hands as witnesses. It was brief and legal and devoid of ceremony, which suited them both. What she had not anticipated was the town's reaction. She had expected gossip. Gossip was the currency of small towns, and she had spent enough time in small towns to know how it moved. What she had not expected was the organized quality of the hostility, the way it coordinated itself almost immediately, as though it had been waiting for a reason. The first evidence was when she rode into town 3 days after the wedding to collect a supply order at the general's like this. The man behind the counter, Haverford, she had since learned his name, kept her waiting while he helped 2 customers who had arrived after her. She said nothing. When he finally turned to her, he was apologetic in the excessive, distancing way of someone who has been told to be difficult and doesn't enjoy being told. The supply order was short. She checked it against the list she had written and found that 2 items had been omitted: smoked pork and lamp oil, neither of which was out of stock because she could see the lamp oil on the shelf behind him. "You'll have to come back for those," Haverford said. Why? He couldn't give her an answer that held water. She bought what she could from the store across the street, paid cash, and drove back to the ranch. That evening she wrote a careful inventory of what they had, what they needed, and what she expected to need through winter, and she presented it to Colton at dinner. He looked at it for a long time. Mercer has an arrangement with Haverford, he said. I suspected something like that. I can ride in and... No, she said. If you fight every battle for me, they'll never stop thinking they need to be fought. She tapped the inventory sheet. I need you to tell me what other suppliers you use. I'll work around Haverford. He told her about a trading post 20 miles north, run by a man named Ike Calloway, who had no particular loyalty to Mercer or anyone else. She made a note of it. You're going to make enemies, Colton said. I already have them, she said. I might as well get something done in the meantime. He looked at her across the table with an expression she couldn't quite read, not the impressed look she had gotten from people sometimes, which always had a faint condescension underneath it, the surprise that she was capable of a thought. This was something else, something more like recognition. Fair enough, he said. She had been at the ranch for a week when she first understood how close to the edge they were operating. She found it in the ledger book, a battered, water-stained thing that Colton kept in a desk drawer and clearly didn't enjoy looking at. The numbers weren't disastrous, but they were close. 2 bad seasons back-to-back had drained the reserve, and the coming winter threatened a third. She didn't say anything about it immediately. She spent 3 days going over the numbers, cross-referencing them against the supply inventory and the notes she had made about the herd. She talked to Holt, the young hand who turned out to be eager and anxious to prove himself, and to an older man named Gustavo, who had been with Colton for 7 years and knew the land as well as anyone. Gustavo watched her work for a day before he said anything. You know ranching, he said finally. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a man revising a map he thought he already knew. I know numbers, she said, and I know winter. This winter's going to be bad, Gustavo said. Feel it in the ground. I know, she said. That's what I'm trying to prepare for. Gustavo nodded slowly, and from that point on he answered her questions without the slight pause that had preceded his answers before, the pause that meant, should I really be telling her this? She presented the numbers to Colton the following Sunday evening, spread across the kitchen table with her notes alongside. He listened to everything she said without interrupting, which she was already learning was characteristic of him. He did not fill silence the way some men did, as though silence itself was a problem to be solved. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You're saying we have about 8 weeks of buffer, he said. If the winter hits hard before mid-January, less than that. And if we lose the north pasture feed, we'll need to make decisions about the herd before December, she said. Which cattle, what to sell early, what to move where. He looked at the papers, then at her. You've been here 10 days. I have been, she said. Most people don't, he stopped. Most people don't what? Most people come to a new situation and spend the first month figuring out where things are, he said. You've been here 10 days and you already know more about this ranch's finances than I do. You knew, she said. You just didn't want to look at it. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, no, I didn't. Something happened in the room then, not dramatic, not cinematic. Just the small, ordinary thing of 2 people deciding, separately and simultaneously, that they were going to trust each other. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to work with. Tell me what we need to do, Colton said. And she did. She was not happy exactly. She wasn't sure she had ever been exactly happy, and she had long since stopped mistaking comfort for happiness or mistaking the absence of cruelty for kindness. But she was useful. She was busy. She was building something out of the materials available to her, the way she had always built things. And somewhere in the second week, coming in from the barn, after showing Holt the right way to assess a horse's leg for early swelling, she paused in the doorway of the ranch house and looked at the mountains in the fading afternoon light, and she thought, this could work. She did not let herself think more than that. This could work was enough. It had to be. The cold settled in early that year. Mabel had been warned about mountain winters. Gustavo had told her, plainly and without drama, that the first real freeze would come before she expected it and stay longer than she wanted. She had listened and adjusted her timeline accordingly, moving the supply runs closer together, pushing Colton to make decisions about the herd earlier than he was comfortable making them. He made them. That was something she was learning about him, he argued sometimes, pushed back in the quiet way of a man who didn't like being rushed. But when she put numbers in front of him, he dealt with them. He didn't pretend problems weren't there. That was rarer than she had expected. The first hard frost hit on a Tuesday in late October, 3.5 weeks after she had arrived. She woke before dawn to find the water in the kitchen basin had a thin skin of ice on it, and she stood in the cold kitchen for a moment, doing the math in her head, recalculating timelines that had already been calculated twice. Then she lit the stove and started the day. The ranch ran on a rhythm she was still learning to hear, the way you learn to hear a new house, the sounds it makes settling at night, the specific silence before weather changes, the difference between the creak that means nothing and the creak that means something has given way. She was getting better at it. Gustavo helped without quite meaning to, because he narrated the land constantly in the low, practical way of a man who had talked to horses and cattle so long that commentary had become second nature. Ground's too hard, he'd say, walking past her toward the barn. Or winds shifted. North now. She listened to all of it. Holt was a different kind of teacher, younger than she'd first estimated, barely 20, with the particular anxiety of someone who desperately wanted to do the job right and kept getting in his own way. She had corrected his fence work, and he had taken it with the slightly mortified grace of a young man who knows a woman has just shown him something he should have known. Since then he had been careful around her, not hostile, just watchful, trying to figure out what category to put her in. She didn't rush that process. Categories were earned. There were two other hands she hadn't found a clear read on yet. A lean, weathered man named Denny, who communicated primarily in head movements and single syllables, and a broader, sunburned man called Fletcher, who was capable of real work, but had the habit of leaning on a fence and watching other people do it first. She noted both of them. She didn't form opinions she couldn't support yet. Colton worked the land the way she had expected from his letter, practically, without sentiment, with the specific exhaustion of a man who had been responsible for something large for a long time, without much relief. He was up before light and rarely inside before dark. He ate what she put on the table without complaint, and usually without much comment, though he had started, in the third week, to occasionally say something about the food, not compliments exactly, more like observations. The stew's different tonight, or haven't had cornbread like this since I was a kid. She was not sure what to do with these observations, so she said thank you and moved on, and he seemed to find that an acceptable arrangement. What was harder to navigate was the town. She had expected the hostility to fade as time passed, the way most social friction fades when it stops being fed by novelty. Instead, it was solidifying. Each time she rode into Redstone Creek, which she did at least twice a week, because the ranch required supplies and information, and she was not about to hide herself out on the property and let people think she was ashamed. She felt the town's opinion of her like a weather system. Not violent, just present, relentless. The sharp-faced woman from her first day was named Clara Benton, wife of the man who ran the town's only bank. Clara had a gift for a particular kind of social damage, the kind that left no fingerprints. She never said anything directly cruel to Mabel's face. What she did was turn conversations just slightly the wrong way, introduce doubts as concerned observations, and smile at Mabel with a warmth that didn't reach anything behind her eyes. "It must be so hard," Clara said one afternoon, when Mabel was waiting at the post office, and Clara happened to be there, adjusting to ranch life. After a different kind of upbringing. "I grew up on a farm," Mabel said. "Oh, of course," the smile. "But a cattle ranch is so much more demanding, isn't it? Physically." A pause with a particular weight in it. "I just hope it isn't too much, for either of you." Mabel looked at her for one beat, too. "I appreciate the concern," she said. The tone she used was the tone of someone who does not appreciate the concern. Clara moved on. But the conversation spread. Mabel knew it spread because she could feel the shape of it in subsequent interactions, the slight shift in how people held themselves when she came near. Clara had planted something, and it was growing. She told Colton about it that evening, not because she wanted him to intervene. She'd been clear enough about that, but because she had decided that transparency was the most practical policy between them. He needed to know what was happening in his town, even when it was happening because of her. He listened. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara Benton's been running social weather in this town for 15 years, he said. "Before you got here, she was doing it to May Tilson and the Garrett family and anybody else she decided she didn't like. That's useful to know. What she says is usually the opposite of what she means," he said. "She says she's concerned. She means she wants people worried." He looked at Mabel. "Most people in this town know how she operates. They don't always push back against it, but they know." "Who's the most useful person I could talk to?" Mabel said. He thought about it. Nora Wick runs the telegraph office. She's been here longer than Clara, and she has a different kind of standing. Does she like you? She tolerates me, he said, which is better than most. Mabel added Nora Wick to the list of things to attend to. She found Nora 3 days later, a small, spare woman of about 60, with the efficient movements of someone who had long ago stopped spending energy on anything she didn't need. She was behind the telegraph counter when Mabel came in, and she looked up without expression. "Mrs. Rourke," she said. "Miss Wick." Mabel placed a telegram she'd drafted for a supply company in Denver on the counter. "I'd like to send this." Nora read it, not the quick scan of a professional, but a real reading. "Smart," she said, without looking up. "Going around Haverford. He makes it necessary." Nora processed the telegram, gave Mabel the cost, and took the money. Then she looked up. "You're not what I expected," she said. It wasn't a compliment or an insult. It was information. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would cry," Nora said. "Or someone who would come in here swinging." "You're doing neither." "Not yet," Mabel said. Something crossed Nora's face, not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement. "Clara Benton doesn't usually have staying power once her targets stop reacting," Nora said. "Just so you know." "I've handled women like Clara before," Mabel said. "Not like the one in this town," Nora said. "She's got Wade Mercer's ear, and Mercer's got money." The name settled in the room like a stone dropped in water. "What's Mercer's real problem with my husband?" Mabel asked. Nora studied her for a moment, assessing. Then she said, "That creek on the north edge of Colton's land. The one that runs year-round. Mercer's south pasture runs dry every July. He needs that water access. Colton won't sell it and won't grant easement rights." A pause. "Mercer's the kind of man who interprets no as an opening bid." Mabel nodded slowly. She filed every word of it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," Nora said. "Come back when you need to send another telegram." She came back the following week, and the week after. She and Nora Wick never became friends in any warm or uncomplicated sense, but they developed a mutual regard built on competence and directness, which was worth more, in Mabel's experience, than warmth without either of those things. November arrived, and the temperature dropped with it, fast and definitive. The mountains to the north began to show snow on their upper slopes, which Gustavo said meant heavier weather coming to the valley floor, within 3 weeks, possibly 2. Mabel had been pushing for the herd's winter positioning since October. She'd worked out from the ranch's past records and from talking to Gustavo that the most vulnerable point was the northeast section, a long run of pasture that backed up to a canyon and had poor natural shelter from north winds. In bad winters, cattle drifted into that canyon and got stranded. She proposed moving the most vulnerable portion of the herd, the young cattle and the weaker steers, to the southern pasture, closer to the ranch buildings, before the serious cold came. It meant more daily work for the hands and less optimal grazing, but it reduced the catastrophic risk. Colton chewed on it. "It's a lot of moving for cattle that might be fine where they are," he said. "They might be fine," she agreed. "What happens if they're not?" He didn't have an answer for that she couldn't counter, so in the end he agreed to move half of the targeted group, a compromise she accepted, because half was better than none, and because she had learned, in their first weeks together, that pushing Colton past his own judgment on a single conversation rarely produced good results. He made better decisions when he felt like he had arrived at them himself, which meant her job was often to lay out the information and then step back and let it work on him. It was not a perfect system, but it was honest. They moved the cattle on a gray Thursday, all 5 hands working through a morning that kept threatening snow and never quite delivered. It was cold, ugly work, and by midday Holt's hands were so stiff he could barely manage his rope. She saw it and handed him her own gloves. Without comment, she'd brought 2 pairs, which was not an accident, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been caught expecting the wrong thing. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. "Mind the fence at the south corner," she said. "It's soft at the post." He nodded and rode off, and Gustavo, who had seen the exchange, said nothing. But she caught the slight adjustment of his expression. The snow came that night, not the catastrophic kind, not yet, but real and purposeful, covering the ranch in 8 inches by morning and making the daily work twice as hard for the next 4 days. She spent those 4 days doing the work alongside the hands, which she could see they hadn't expected. She was not doing it to impress anyone. She was doing it because the work needed doing, and she was capable of doing it, and standing inside, watching other people work through a window, was not something she was constitutionally able to manage for very long. Denny, who had not said more than 20 words to her in 3 weeks, said on the third day, "You ride better than you let on." "I don't let on anything," she said. "No," he said. "You don't." And that was the whole of it, but she counted it. It was during those 4 days, while the snow had the ranch pressed down, and the world had narrowed to the immediate hard work of keeping everything alive, that she first noticed something was wrong with the livestock count. She had been keeping her own tallies. It had become habit. The way keeping track of numbers had always become habit, and in reviewing her notes on the 4th evening she found a discrepancy. Small enough to be an error, too consistent to be one. She checked it twice. Then she got out the ranch's own records and checked them against hers. 12 head of cattle, across 3 separate entries in the past 6 weeks, had been recorded differently in the ranch records than in her own counts. In the ranch records, the numbers were higher. In her direct counts, they were lower. She sat with this information for a long time, alone at the kitchen table, while the stove ticked and the wind moved along the eaves. There were innocent explanations, record-keeping errors, cattle that had moved between pastures and been counted twice in the official ledger, once in her tally. She was not going to arrive at the worst conclusion before she had ruled out the ordinary ones. She spent the next week ruling them out. She was careful about it. She didn't tell Colton yet. She didn't want to put something in front of him until she was sure, because an accusation based on incomplete evidence was worse than no accusation at all. She didn't change anything she was doing visibly. She just began paying attention in ways she hadn't before, which mostly meant being in places, and at times when people weren't expecting her. What she found, piece by piece over 8 days, was this: the discrepancies weren't random. They clustered around specific pasture sections and specific dates, and those dates corresponded. She eventually realized, to days when 2 particular things coincided. Colton was away from the ranch for any reason, and one of Wade Mercer's riders had been seen in the general area of Redstone Creek. She found the physical evidence on a Tuesday, on the far northeast fence line, half hidden by a snowdrift that had partially melted and refrozen. Cut section of fence, repaired badly and recently, not the kind of repair a person does to fix something, but the kind you do to hide that something was opened. The kind of repair that would hold for a few weeks and then let go. She crouched in the frozen mud and looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up and looked at the canyon beyond the fence line, the same canyon she had been worried about since October, the one with poor shelter, the one where cattle got stranded in bad weather. The picture assembled itself in her mind with a cold, steady clarity. Someone was cutting this fence. Someone was moving cattle out through this section, into the canyon, under cover of night or bad weather, where they could be gathered and moved without being seen from the ranch. The bad repairs were meant to last just long enough that the losses would look like winter attrition, cattle wandering, cattle dying in cold snaps, rather than what they actually were. She stood in the wind and thought about Wade Mercer and his need for water rights and his interpretation of no as an opening bid. She thought about the fact that weakening a neighboring rancher's herd through a hard winter was exactly the kind of move a man like Mercer would make, the kind that was hard to prove and easy to disguise as bad luck. She walked back to the ranch, and she did not change her expression when she came in, because she had learned young that a face that gives nothing away is worth more than any argument. That evening at dinner, she said casually, "I'd like to ride the northeast fence line with you tomorrow. All of it." Colton looked up. "Something wrong?" "I want to see the whole perimeter before the next storm," she said. Good practice to know it. He accepted this. He had stopped being surprised, in small ways, by her requests for information, which she took as progress. They rode it together the next morning, and she let him find the cut section himself, watching his face as he crouched where she had crouched the day before. She watched him understand what he was looking at, not immediately, but in stages, the way a man works through something he doesn't want to be true. He stood up slowly. "This wasn't weather," he said. "No, and it wasn't recent, 6 weeks, I think. Maybe more." He looked at the canyon, then at her. "You already know who," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have a strong read on it," she said carefully. "I don't have proof that would hold in front of a judge." "Mercer," he said. "Likely his men," she said. "Whether on his instruction or his knowledge, that's what I don't know yet." Colton stood in the cold for a long moment, with the wind working against his coat, And she watched him fight the impulse that was written all over him, the impulse to ride straight into town and confront the man directly, which would accomplish nothing except warning Mercer that they knew. Don't, she said. I know, he said. He sounded like a man who hated knowing it. If he finds out we've discovered it, he'll stop and deny everything. We'd have a repaired fence and no cattle to show for it. What do you want to do? I want to understand the full scope first, she said. Then I want to close it in a way that he can't recover from. He looked at her. Give me 2 weeks, she said. The silence stretched. The wind pushed. Somewhere in the canyon below, a sound moved through the rock that might have been wind and might have been something else. 2 weeks, he said. She spent those 2 weeks dismantling Wade Mercer's operation piece by piece, from the inside out, in ways he couldn't see. She mapped every instance of cattle loss against every entry in the ranch records, cross-referenced against weather logs and her own observation notes, and built a document that showed not just the losses, but the pattern, the deliberate, seasonal, carefully paced pattern of a man who was bleeding a ranch slowly enough that it looked like misfortune rather than murder. She found a second compromised fence section on the western edge, smaller and more recently cut. She found a place where the ground showed the marks of cattle being moved. At night, the hoofprints pressed deep in a way that meant pressure, meant driven, not the wandering prints of animals moving on their own. She brought Gustavo into it on the 10th day, because she needed someone who knew the land better than she did, and because she had read Gustavo well enough by now to trust his loyalty. He listened to everything she laid out, sitting across the kitchen table from her, while Colton was in town at the farrier. When she finished, Gustavo was quiet for a long time. Mercer's been after this ranch for 3 years, he said finally. Before you, before a lot of things. He looked at his hands, then at her. I thought maybe this winter was just bad luck. It isn't. No, he said. I can see that now. A pause. What do you need from me? I need you to tell me exactly who has access to those fence sections. Without it looking strange, she said. Ranch hands move on and off these pastures all the time. Someone has either been cutting it themselves, or they've been making it easy for Mercer's men to get in. Gustavo's jaw tightened. You think someone here? I don't know, she said. I need to rule it out. He worked through it with her, carefully, and without protesting the question, which told her something important about him. They identified 2 possibilities, Fletcher, whose work patterns had small gaps she'd noticed without understanding, and a rotation of days off that seemed to correspond with the compromise dates. She didn't confront Fletcher. She changed his assignment instead, pulling him off the northeast pasture work entirely under the pretense of needing him closer to the main barn. Then she watched the fence. On the 14th day, 3 days before the next serious storm system was due to arrive, she was positioned in the tree line above the northeast pasture before dawn, in cold that made her hands ache despite the gloves when she saw them. 2 riders, moving along the outside of the fence line in the gray pre-dawn light, with a 3rd man on foot at the fence itself. She watched them work the cut section, not the one she'd found, a new one, freshly opened, and begin to push 4 head of cattle through it. She counted. She noted the horses, their markings, their builds, as much as she could see in the low light. She noted the direction they moved into the canyon. Then she rode back to the ranch and woke Colton. He was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes. How many, he said. 3 of them. 2 riders, 1 on the fence. She was pulling on her 2nd layer of coat as she talked. They've pushed 4 head through the new cut, moving northwest into the canyon. That's if they're moving northwest, they're going toward Mercer's back pasture, Colton said. His voice had gone very flat. That's his access, through his own land. He planned it carefully, she said. If anyone followed the cattle, they'd be on Mercer's property, and he could call it trespassing. Colton had his coat on and was checking his rifle. Colton, she said. He looked at her. We need a witness, she said. Someone not from this ranch. He stopped. If it's just us, she said, Mercer will call it a dispute between neighbors, and half the town will believe him. We need someone with no stake in this. He was already thinking. Nora Wick, too far, and it's 3 a.m. Judge Harlan lives 6 miles south. We don't have time for 6 miles, she was thinking fast. Who's the closest person who isn't Mercer's and isn't ours? Pete Dawson, Colton said after a moment. Small homestead, 2 miles east. He doesn't like Mercer. Does he like you? He tolerates me. Get him, she said. I'll track the cattle. Colton looked at her with an expression she was getting familiar with, the one where he wanted to argue and couldn't find the argument. You're not going into that canyon alone, he said. I won't go in, she said. I'll track from the ridge. I need to know where they're moving them, and I need to be sure before you get back. She held his gaze. Go, he went. She rode the ridgeline in the dark, with her breath coming in clouds, and her mind very still and focused, not the calm of someone who wasn't afraid, but the specific operational calm of a person who has learned to set fear aside until there's time for it. The wind was picking up from the north, which meant the temperature was dropping, which meant the storm system was arriving early. She tracked the cattle by sound first, then by sight as the sky began to lighten in a thin gray line to the east. 3 men, 4 cattle, moving in a deliberate line northwest through the canyon floor. She stayed high, stayed back, and moved when the wind covered her movement. When they stopped, she stopped. She watched them push the cattle toward a gate in a fence line she hadn't known. Was there a fence that didn't appear on any of the ranch maps she'd studied, set deep in the canyon where it would be invisible from the ridge under normal circumstances? Her blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. That fence had taken work to install. That fence had taken planning and time, and the certain knowledge that it would be used. This wasn't opportunistic. This was a campaign. She stayed on the ridge until she had seen enough, until she had fixed in her mind the exact location of the gate, the direction the cattle were moved, the markings of all 3 men's horses. Then she rode back to the northwest edge of the canyon and found a position where she could see both the canyon entrance and the trail from the east, and she waited for Colton. He came back 40 minutes later with Pete Dawson, a stout, reddish man in his 50s, with the slightly aggrieved air of someone dragged out of bed in a temperature that made such dragging genuinely unreasonable. He looked at Mabel with an expression that moved from surprise to assessment to a kind of grudging neutrality. She found it, Colton said to him. All of it. Found what exactly? Dawson said. I'll show you, Mabel said. Bring your rifle and stay low. She took them back along the ridge in the gray early light, talking in a low voice as they rode, laying out what she'd seen, what it meant, where the fence was, what the fence meant. Dawson listened without interrupting, which went up in her estimate of him. She showed them the cut fence section. Then she showed them the track marks. When she showed Dawson the hidden fence line in the canyon, he was quiet for a long time. That's been there a while, he said. He had a rancher's eye, reading the weathering on the posts. That's not new. No, she said. Dawson looked at Colton, then at Mabel, then back at the fence. I'll testify to what I'm seeing, he said. But you're going to need more than a fence and some tracks to go up against Mercer. I have more, Mabel said. She had the document. The 13 pages she had built, over 14 days, the pattern, the dates, the cross-references, the cumulative losses presented in a form that was too systematic to be accidental and too detailed to be fabricated. She had the 2 fence cuts and the track evidence. She had Pete Dawson. She had Gustavo, who had 7 years of knowledge about this land and what it should look like. And she had the approaching storm, which was not an advantage but was a clock, because whatever Mercer's men had moved into that canyon last night, the storm that was coming would either cover the evidence or make it harder to move. They needed to move faster than they had planned. Riding back to the ranch in the rising wind, with the sky darkening to the north in a way that meant the storm was not 2 days out but 1, she felt the full weight of what was coming, not fear exactly, but the kind of heightened clarity that arrives when you understand that something is going to require everything you have. Colton rode up beside her. He had not said much since Dawson had made his statement at the canyon fence. The storm, she said. It's coming faster, I know, he said. It was always going to come faster. She looked at him. He was looking north, at the darkening sky, with the expression of a man reading something he's read before, and doesn't like the ending of. Whatever Mercer's planning, she said, he planned it around this storm. Colton turned to look at her. He's not done, she said. What we saw last night was preparation. He's going to use the storm to cover something bigger. The wind hit them then, a hard northern gust that drove right through every layer she had on and made the horses toss their heads and pull. She held her seat and kept her eyes on the trail. Whatever was coming, it was going to arrive with the snow. The storm arrived the way Gustavo had predicted, not with warning, but with decision. By noon, the sky had gone the color of old iron, pressing low and flat over the valley, in a way that made the mountains disappear entirely, as though they had never been there. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 hours. The horses in the barn felt it before any person did. She heard them shifting and stamping. When she came through to check the water troughs, that particular restless energy animals carry when the air is about to do something serious. She spent the morning preparing in the methodical, unglamorous way that real preparation looks, checking and rechecking the feed stores, making sure the water supply lines wouldn't freeze. Before she could insulate them further, moving the last of the vulnerable cattle into the south pasture holding area she and Colton had set up 3 weeks earlier. The hands worked with her, mostly without being asked, because the weather was legible to anyone who had spent a winter in these mountains, and the work was obvious. Colton had ridden out at first light to check the canyon rim. He'd said nothing more about it over breakfast. Just eaten quickly and gone, and she had not stopped him, because the information he might bring back was worth the hour it would cost. He came back at 11, with snow beginning to fall, and his expression closed in a way that meant the news was what they'd feared. 3 sets of fresh tracks on the canyon floor, he said, unsaddling in the barn, with the quick movements of a man who needed his hands free to talk. Not from this morning, from last night after we left. They went back in. How many cattle? Hard to tell. Grounds disturbed, but the tracks lead northwest, same direction as before, deeper into the canyon. He turned to look at her. They're moving the herd. She understood immediately. They're using the storm. If the herd moves under a blizzard, any tracks get covered, and any cattle that don't make it through get attributed to weather. That's what I think, he said. How many of our cattle are still in the northeast pasture? 40 head, maybe 42, the ones we didn't move. The ones he hadn't fully agreed to move. She did not say this. It wasn't useful. If they drive 40 head into that canyon in this storm, she said, and push them northwest toward that hidden fence, we lose them, Colton said. All of them. Either they make it to Mercer's land and we can't prove how they got there, or they don't make it through the canyon and the storm covers it. She was already turning over the problem. How long before the storm makes the canyon impassable? 4 hours, maybe 5 if we're lucky, then we have 4 hours. He nodded once, the tight nod of a man who has already made the decision and is waiting for the logistics to catch up. She called the hands together in the barn, Gustavo, Holt, Denny, and Fletcher, because this was not the moment to finesse the Fletcher question. This was the moment to use every person available and sort out the rest afterward. She laid it out plainly, the way she laid everything out, what had been happening, what was happening now, what they needed to do. Fletcher's face, when she described the sabotage, went through several stages she watched carefully. Surprise was there. Guilt flickered through it too. Not the guilt of someone who'd participated, she thought, but the particular guilt of someone who had not paid enough attention and was realizing, in real time, that this had cost something. She would deal with that later. Holt said, "They're going to drive them tonight? In this? They picked this storm on purpose," Gustavo said quietly. He was looking at Mabel when he said it, not at Holt. Smart. Not smart enough, Mabel said. Here's what we're doing. Gustavo, do you know the old mountain trail? The one that cuts above the canyon on the north side? Gustavo's eyebrows moved. The Lindquist Trail. It's not been used in years. But it's passable? On foot, maybe. On horseback in a blizzard. He stopped. It would be faster than going through the canyon floor. If a person knew it well. Do you know it well? A pause. Well enough. Then you're leading us up it. She looked at Colton. If we go through the canyon floor, we'll meet them head on and be outnumbered in terrain they've already mapped. If we take the Lindquist Trail above the canyon, we can get ahead of the herd before they reach the hidden fence. Cut them off before they cross. Colton was studying the barn wall the way he studied things when he was running the map in his head. The trail comes down near the canyon's northwest bend, he said slowly. Yes, which is where they'll be pushing the cattle toward, because that's the direction of the hidden fence. So we'd be coming down on top of them, from above. In a blizzard, she looked at him steadily. They won't expect it. They'll have men with guns, Denny said. First full sentence she'd heard from him in days. So will we, she said. The silence in the barn had a particular quality, not hesitation exactly, but the moment before people commit, when they're measuring what they have against what's required. Holt said, I'm in. Quickly, the way young men decide things, before the thinking can complicate the feeling. Denny nodded once. Fletcher said, tell me what you need, and whatever she thought about Fletcher's attentiveness before today, she accepted that now. Gustavo looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something between admiration and concern and the specific worry of a man who has seen bad mountain weather before and is doing the math. The trail will be icy, he said. I know. A horse goes down on that trail in this wind. I know, she said again. We don't have another option. He exhaled slowly. No, we don't. He stood up from the fence rail he'd been leaning against. I'll need 20 minutes to check the horses. You have 15, she said. Storm's not waiting. She had 12 minutes to go to the house, and she used them deliberately, not to hesitate, but to think clearly one last time before the action made thinking impossible. She pulled on every layer she owned, wrapped her hands in the wool she'd been saving for worse cold than this, checked the rifle that Colton had shown her how to load 3 weeks ago in the kind of practical, non-dramatic way he'd shown her most things. She was frightened. She acknowledged this to herself in the same practical way. She acknowledged everything directly and without decoration. She was frightened and her hands were cold, and she was about to ride a deteriorating mountain trail above a canyon in a blizzard to confront men who worked for someone with nothing to lose and a great deal to gain. She was also the only person who had put all of this together, the only person who had seen it clearly enough to act on it. That didn't feel like destiny or purpose or any of the elevated language people used for moments like this. It just felt like a fact, the way the storm was a fact, and the hidden fence was a fact, and the 40 head of cattle in the northeast pasture were a fact. She finished checking the rifle and went back to the barn. They rode out at noon into snow that had already committed to being serious, not the light, tentative fall of an hour ago, but a driving, directional snow with wind behind it that pushed into every gap in clothing and made the horses drop their heads and work. The temperature had fallen again while she was in the house. She could feel it in the way the air hurt the inside of her nose. Gustavo took point on the trail. He rode with the particular confidence of someone navigating from memory rather than sight, which was the only kind of navigation available because the trail was buried under 6 inches of new snow and disappearing further by the minute. She rode second behind him, close enough that she could follow his line exactly. Colton rode behind her, then Holt, then Denny, then Fletcher at the rear. The Lindquist Trail climbed steeply from the valley floor, switchbacking him up the north face of the canyon through a dense stand of pine that offered some shelter from the wind in the first quarter mile. She focused on her horse, a steady mare named Ruth that she had been working with since her second week at the ranch. Ruth didn't like this and made no secret of it, but she was the kind of horse that worked through what she didn't like rather than acting on it, which was the only quality that mattered right now. The trees thinned out as they climbed, and the wind found them properly. It was the kind of cold that isn't gradual, it arrives like a wall, and the shock of it made her eyes water and her grip tighten on the reins. She heard one of the men behind her say something bitten short by the wind, and she didn't turn to see who. The trail was worse than she had expected. Gustavo had said icy, and it was icy in places, but it was also narrow in ways she hadn't accounted for, places where the canyon wall to the right dropped away sharply, and the trail was barely wide enough for a horse moving carefully. Ruth felt the drop. She could tell by the slight sideways tension, the way the horse was always slightly aware of the edge without looking at it. She looked at it once, down into the gray-white void of the canyon below, and then she looked at Gustavo's back and kept her eyes there. They were 40 minutes up the trail when Gustavo raised his hand, and they all stopped. She pulled up beside him. The wind was screaming up here a different pitch than below, high and thin and constant. Gustavo leaned close so she could hear him. Listen. She listened. Below them and to the southwest, she heard it faint, carried up in fragments by the wind, the sound of cattle, the bawling of animals being moved against their will, in cold they didn't understand. They were already in the canyon. She looked at Gustavo. He held up 4 fingers, then spread them to indicate estimation, maybe more. Then he pointed northwest along the trail, indicating a descent point ahead. She nodded. She moved back to where she could be heard by Colton. They're already moving them, she said into his ear. Maybe 20 minutes behind where we need to be. How far to the descent? Asked Gustavo. Colton moved up. A brief, wind-snatched exchange. He came back. 12 minutes if we push. Push, she said. They pushed. The trail narrowed further in the next section, climbing to a point she realized later was the highest point of the entire route, a ridge with nothing on either side but wind and depth, and her world compressed entirely to the width of Ruth's back and the bobbing shape of Gustavo's horse ahead. She did not think about what would happen if Ruth's shoe slipped on the rock that the wind had scoured clear of snow. She thought about the direction of travel and the 12 minutes and the sound of cattle below. The descent began with a relief that was entirely physical, the trail widening slightly, the wind dropping as the canyon wall rose to shelter them on the west side, the angle changing so Ruth could use her hindquarters to brake, rather than fighting for every step. Gustavo moved faster now, reading something in the ground or the air that she couldn't entirely follow, and she let him read it. They came down into the canyon in a ravine choked with scrub and frozen grass, emerging on the canyon floor in a flat, snow-covered stretch that she recognized immediately from her pre-dawn observation. They were above the hidden fence line, to the northwest of it, exactly where she had calculated. Gustavo pulled up and turned in the saddle. There, he said. She looked. Through the snow heavy now, the visibility down to perhaps 40 yards, she could make out the shapes. Cattle, moving in a loose, stressed group, pushed from behind by 2 riders. A third rider was positioned to the north, blocking escape in that direction. 3 riders, 40 head, moving exactly where she had said they would move. She turned to Colton. We come at them from the north and east simultaneously, she said. Split them from the herd. The cattle will stop on their own if they lose the pressure from behind. They're exhausted and scared. They want to stop. The riders are armed, Colton said. So are we. And we have the high ground, and they don't know we're here. Mabel Colton. She looked at him directly. The snow was hitting her face, and she let it. If we wait, they cross that fence line, and we have nothing. If we go now, we have everything. A pause. I know what I'm asking. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than she expected, and in it she saw something she hadn't seen from him before, not admiration, which she'd gotten occasionally, not assessment, which she'd gotten constantly. This was something quieter and more fundamental. The look of a man who has found someone equal to the situation and is recognizing it fully for the first time. Gustavo, Denny east flank, he said. Fletcher, stay with the horses. Call out if anyone comes from the south. Holt with me. He looked at Mabel. You're with me. She had not expected that. She had expected to be positioned somewhere safe. She felt something about the fact that he hadn't positioned her somewhere safe, something that took up no words and needed none. They moved in 2 groups through the snow, using the scrub and the terrain for cover. In the way the blizzard itself provided, visibility was poor enough that 50 yards of cover was the same as 500. She rode at Colton's left shoulder, close enough to hear him breathe. The moment they came clear of the last stand of scrub and the cattle resolved fully out of the white, the nearest rider saw them. He was young. She noticed younger than she'd expected. Maybe Holt's age, sitting a nervous paint horse that had been pushed hard. He saw them, and his mouth opened and his hand went for his rifle, and Colton said, very clearly, in a voice designed to carry through wind, "Don't." The young rider looked at the rifle in Colton's hand, and didn't. The second rider was older, harder, a broad man on a gray horse, and he wheeled immediately toward the south, which was the direction of escape. Denny came out of the snow from the east at that moment with the precise timing of someone who had been doing difficult work in difficult conditions for 20 years, and the broad man's horse shied violently, and the man spent the next several seconds managing the horse rather than managing his rifle. The third rider was the one she'd been watching since they'd come down the ravine, the one who had stayed to the north, the one with the deliberate positioning of a man who was supervising rather than working. He didn't go for his weapon, and he didn't run. He sat his horse in the snow and watched the situation resolve itself around him with the particular stillness of someone calculating odds. She had seen men like that before. In her father's dealings in Abilene, in the long accumulated experience of watching people decide whether to fight or accept. This man was deciding. "Get off the horse," Colton said to him. The man looked at Colton with the flat assessment of someone who has hired out his loyalty and is now checking whether his employer's money is worth the arithmetic in front of him. Then he looked at Mabel. She didn't know why he looked at her specifically. Maybe it was because she was the only woman in the canyon. Maybe it was because she was sitting very still in the way of someone who is not bluffing. Maybe it was because her rifle was raised in a way that suggested familiarity rather than performance. Whatever it was, the calculation resolved. He got off the horse. Cattle had stopped moving the moment the pressure from behind was removed exactly as she'd said they would. 41 animals standing in a canyon in a blizzard, confused and tired and going nowhere, which was the best possible outcome, and also the only one she had been willing to accept. Gustavo dismounted and began the patient, careful work of settling the cattle, moving among them with the low sounds of a man who understood what they needed. Holt helped without being told. The young rider on the paint horse sat on the ground in the snow, looking miserable and cold, and about 19 years old. The broad man on the gray was still fighting his horse. Denny, without any visible effort, had placed his own horse between the man and any useful direction. The man they'd pulled off his horse, the supervisor, stood in the snow with his hands visible and watched Colton ride toward him. "What's your name?" Colton said. "Doesn't matter. You work for Mercer." The man didn't answer, which was an answer. "There's a fence line 40 yards northwest of here," Colton said. "Who built it?" Silence. "I know who built it," Colton said. "I'm asking you to confirm it." "I'm not confirming anything," the man said. Mabel rode up alongside Colton and looked down at the man. "You're cold," she said. He looked up at her. "You're going to be colder," she said, "because you're going to stand in that snow while we round up every one of those cattle, and I document everything I'm seeing those cattle. That fence, your horses, your faces, and then you're going to ride back to Wade Mercer, and you're going to tell him that Mabel Rourke was in this canyon tonight." She held the man's gaze without blinking. "And you're going to tell him that she has names and dates, and a pattern going back 8 weeks, and a witness who has no connection to either party, and that she will take all of it to the county judge in the morning." The man's face didn't change much, but something in his eyes shifted. "Tell him," she said, "that his next move is going to be the one that decides everything, and that I've already thought further ahead than he has." The supervisor looked at her for a long moment in the blowing snow, in the canyon, in the particular absurdity and reality of everything that had led to this moment. Then he looked away. She took that as confirmation enough. She began documenting, immediately committing to memory, because she had no paper in a blizzard, the specifics of what she was seeing, the horses' markings, the men's faces and builds, precise location in the canyon, the direction of the fence and the gate in it. She would write it all down the moment she was somewhere she could write. She had learned a long time ago that memory under pressure is unreliable unless you treat it deliberately, walk through each element twice, and fix it consciously, the way you fix a fence post, not by leaning against it, but by setting it properly. Colton had dismounted and was examining the hidden fence up close, and she could see, from the set of his back, that what he was finding was worse than what they'd discussed. She rode over. The fence was solid. Not a temporary installation. The posts were set deep, the wire run tight, the gate hinged properly. This had been planned and built over time, with materials that hadn't materialized out of thin air. "Someone had to haul this in," Colton said. He was looking at the posts. "These are milled. They didn't cut these out of the canyon wood." "Receipts," she said. "If he bought materials like this in volume." "Calloway," Colton said. "Ike Calloway at the North Trading Post. He keeps records of everything." It was the trading post she had been using to route around Haverford. She filed that coincidence away as potentially useful. The snow was thickening, the cattle were settled, but the cold was becoming the primary problem. She could feel it now in her feet, a deep ache that was no longer ignorable, and she knew the hands were in the same condition or worse. "We need to move the herd," she said. "In this, we can't leave 41 cattle in the canyon bottom in a blizzard," she said. "We move them back to the south pasture. Slowly, Gustavo leads. We follow the canyon wall to the east and climb out through the original entrance." She looked at the 3 Mercer men. "The young one can go. He's useless and cold and scared. The other 2 ride in front of us back to the ranch. And then we send for Pete Dawson in the morning," she said. "And then we go to the judge." Colton looked at the 2 men, then at her. "You sure about the young one?" "He's 19 years old," she said. "He's going to go back to his mother's house and never do another thing for Mercer in his life. That's more useful than anything a judge can do with him." Colton thought for a moment. Then he told the young rider to go, using 4 words and a direction. The boy was on his horse and gone in under a minute, moving south and fast, and she didn't watch him leave because she had too much else to manage. Moving 41 head of stressed cattle through a canyon in a blizzard, with 4 available hands and 2 hostile riders to supervise, was not a thing she had ever done before, and she did not pretend otherwise to herself, which was the only advantage she had over someone who would have pretended. She stayed on the outside of the herd and watched for breaks and called out when she saw them. And she watched Gustavo work with a particular astonishment she still occasionally felt about what he could accomplish on horseback, the calm and precision of it, the way the cattle trusted the sound of him. Holt went down once, not off his horse, but the horse slipped on a section of ice and scrambled badly, and for 3 terrible seconds she thought she was going to watch a 20-year-old fall into a canyon wall. The horse found its feet. Holt stayed on. She heard him exhale from 20 yards away, and then he was back working, and she looked away and did not comment, because the thing he needed was to not have that become the story of the night. The broader of the 2 Mercer men tried something on the canyon, climbed back out, tried to edge his horse toward a side cut. She hadn't known was there a possible escape route. Denny was beside him before she had fully registered the movement, and the 2 horses were shoulder to shoulder, and the Mercer man's expression went from calculation to resignation in the time it took her to take a breath. Denny said nothing. He didn't need to. They came out of the canyon 2.5 hours after they'd gone down into it, into a ranch yard that was deep under snow and very dark, the storm having fully arrived by now, the wind driving snow sideways in a way that made the ranch buildings disappear and reappear as shapes in white. She got the cattle into the south pasture holding area, and she got the 2 Mercer men locked in the equipment shed with a padlock. She was fairly certain hadn't been used in 3 years, and held. She found when she tested it, which was the kind of minor good fortune she was willing to accept tonight. She got the horses, dealt with all of them, systematically, every animal checked and dried and fed. Because the horses had done something difficult, and the horses came before the humans, and then she went into the house and stood in front of the stove for a long time without moving. Her feet hurt, not the mild hurt of cold, but the deep, threatening hurt of too much cold for too long, and she pulled off her boots and checked her toes with the methodical concern of a person who has read about frostbite and knows what it looks like in its early stages. They were red and deeply painful and intact. She rubbed feeling back into them with a cloth she heated over the stove and bit back the sounds this process produced. Because there were other people in the house, and she did not want the sound she made to be the story of the night either. Colton came in a few minutes after her. He stood at the door for a moment, snow-covered, exhausted, with the particular hollowed-out looks of someone who has pushed past the edge of what they thought they could do and found something on the other side of it. He looked at her sitting by the stove with her boots off and a cloth on her feet, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Gustavo's hands are bad," he said finally. "Fletcher's helping him. There's a tin of liniment on the kitchen shelf," she said. "Second shelf behind the flour." He nodded. "The 2 men in the equipment shed. They'll be cold," she said. "Not in danger. We can send for Dawson at first light and go to the judge by mid-morning." She looked at her feet and resumed what she was doing. "The storm will ease by dawn," Gustavo said. "Gustavo said this morning it was 2 days out. He was wrong about the timing," she said. "He's not wrong about the pattern. It'll ease by dawn." Colton came fully into the room and sat down at the kitchen table, still in his coat, which meant he wasn't thinking yet, just existing, which was what a person does when they've used everything up. She made coffee. She got up on her half-numb feet and made coffee because the situation required it, and because doing something with her hands was better than sitting with the events of the last several hours and feeling the full weight of them. She set a cup in front of him and sat back down with her own. "You knew where they were going to be," he said, "in the canyon. You knew exactly." "I made a reasonable inference," she said. "Mabel." He looked at her across the table with the same expression she'd seen on the ridge before they'd gone down that full, unguarded recognition. "You built this, all of it. From the numbers in a ledger to a man in the snow telling us everything we need." She wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at the steam. "Mercer hasn't lost yet," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be harder than tonight, in some ways." "I know," she said. "He's going to come at us differently when he finds out his men didn't deliver. I know," Colton said again. "Quieter this time. I know what he'll do." A pause. "But I'm sitting here thinking about where we'd be tonight without you." She looked at him. "Don't make me something I'm not," she said. "It wasn't cold, it was just honest. I'm not," he said. "I'm saying what's true." She looked back at the stove. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves in the long, deliberate moan of a storm, settling in for the night. The cattle were in. The hands were inside. The evidence was intact. The 2 men in the equipment shed were cold, and they would be useful in the morning. She thought about Pete Dawson, and his willingness to testify. She thought about Ike Calloway and his records. She thought about the 13 pages sitting in the desk drawer and what they contained. She thought about Wade Mercer, somewhere warm and comfortable tonight, waiting for news from 3 men who were not going to bring him what he'd sent them for. She thought about what that moment would look like for him, the moment he understood the night had not gone the way he planned. She was not satisfied by the thought. Satisfaction was for after. There was still tomorrow, and tomorrow was going to require everything the night hadn't already taken. She drank her coffee and let the stove work on her frozen feet and watched the fire through the grate. And she did not let herself think past tomorrow morning, because past tomorrow morning was a country she hadn't earned the right to yet. The storm held through the night, and so did she. Gustavo had been right about the storm easing by dawn. She woke to a stillness that was almost disorienting after the hours of wind, the particular quiet that follows hard weather, when the world has exhausted itself, and everything is white and flat and holding its breath. She lay in the thin morning light for a few seconds, running through the list the way she always ran through the list, and then she got up. Her feet were better, still tender in the deep way of tissue that had been stressed and hadn't fully recovered, but functional. She pulled on her boots carefully and went to the kitchen. Colton was already there, which didn't surprise her. She wasn't sure he had slept. He had the look of a man who had spent several hours sitting with his own thoughts, which could go well or badly depending on the man, and with Colton she had learned it usually went toward something useful. "Dawson," she said. "Holt's already writing," he said. "Sent him out 20 minutes ago." She nodded. She started the stove. "The 2 men in the equipment shed," he said. "Fed and checked them an hour ago," he said. "They're not happy. That's appropriate." She put the coffee on. "What did they say?" "The broad one hasn't said anything. The other one," Colton paused. "He talked a little. Last night, apparently, to Fletcher. Fletcher came to me with it this morning." Turned. "Mercer's been planning the canyon operation since August," Colton said. "According to what Fletcher heard. Started the fence in September, ran the first cattle through in October. The goal wasn't just to bleed the herd, he wanted the losses to accumulate through winter, and then make an offer on the ranch in February, when the numbers looked worst." She stood very still. "He was going to offer," Colton continued, his voice carrying the flatness of a man keeping himself measured, "a price low enough to look generous given the apparent losses. By that point, with the herd down and 2 bad seasons behind us, it might have looked like the only option." She thought about February. She thought about what the ranch would have looked like in February without her, without the inventory she'd built, and the patterns she'd caught. She thought about Colton sitting across the table from Wade Mercer in February, with numbers that told a story had written. "He didn't account for me," she said. "Not with pride. Just as a fact." "No," Colton said, "he didn't." She poured the coffee when it was ready, set a cup in front of him, sat down across the table. "Fletcher," she said. "He knew something." Colton looked at his cup. Not directly. "Mercer had approached him months ago, before you arrived, with some vague talk about opportunities for a man who kept his eyes open. Fletcher didn't take money, didn't pass information that he's aware of. But he also didn't tell me about the approach. Why not?" "He was embarrassed," Colton said. "He didn't think it amounted to anything." She considered Fletcher's face in the barn when she had laid out the sabotage, the guilt she had read there, and attributed to inattention rather than anything worse. "Is that true, do you think?" "I think it's mostly true," Colton said. "I also think Fletcher is 28 years old and not always thinking past the next week." He paused. "I'm going to let him stay, but he knows what was almost lost." "That's your decision," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you so you know where I am." She looked at him across the table. Outside, the snow-quiet world sat around the house like something waiting. "Mercer's going to find out what happened before we reach the judge," she said. "That supervisor, wherever he went last night, he'll have reached someone by now." "I know. He might try to move first. Discredit the men in the shed. Call the whole thing a misunderstanding. Come at it from a legal angle." "What kind of legal angle?" "Claim the fence was on his land. Claim the cattle wandered onto Double M property of their own accord, and his men were simply—" She stopped herself. "Doesn't matter what angle he tries. What matters is that we get to the judge before he does." Colton looked at her for a moment. "Dawson's going to take 2 hours to get here. Then we need to get to town." I know the math," she said. "Eat something. We're going to need the time." Pete Dawson arrived at 8:30, red-faced from the cold and riding a horse that clearly hadn't enjoyed the journey. He came inside, accepted coffee, and listened while Mabel laid out what they needed from him in front of the judge. Dawson was the kind of man who took in information without much visible response, and then asked one or two questions that revealed he'd absorbed it completely. He asked, had Ike Calloway confirmed the supply records yet? And what was the condition of the two men they'd detained? She answered both. No, Calloway hadn't been contacted yet. That was on the list for this morning. And the two men were cold and unhappy, and one of them had been talking. Dawson nodded slowly. The one who talked, is he willing to say it to the judge? I don't know, she said honestly. He talked to my hand, not to us. You need him to say it in front of the judge, or you don't have much beyond a fence and some cattle tracks, Dawson said. The fence, Mercer's lawyers will argue, was legitimately placed on contested boundary land. He shook his head. Tracks in snow. In a canyon a lot of people use. She had known this. She had been sitting with it since the kitchen table last night, turning it over. What we need, she said, is Calloway's records. If Mercer purchased milled fence posts and wire in the volume that fence required, there's a record of it. That's not contested boundary land, that's planned construction on someone else's property. And if the purchase dates align with the September build that his own man apparently described, that's the case, Dawson said. Then we go to Calloway first and the judge second, she said. Colton said, Calloway's 20 miles north. We can make it in 3 hours if the roads are passable, she said. Which they are. The storm blew from the northwest, so the north road is the clearest. Dawson looked at her with the appraising expression she was getting familiar with from men who had adjusted their expectations upward and were still adjusting. All right, he said, let's go. They left Gustavo in charge of the ranch, and the two detained men, Gustavo, who had spent 7 years on this land and who she trusted with it, the way you trust a foundation, and rode north in the white morning, the three of them, with the sky gone pale blue after the storm and the temperature still hard but no longer punishing. Ike Calloway's trading post sat at the junction of two roads in a shallow valley 22 miles north of Redstone Creek, a rambling collection of buildings that had been added to over decades by a man who apparently built a new room every time he needed to store something rather than organizing what he already had. Calloway himself appeared to be constructed on similar principles, a big man somewhere between 50 and 70, with the deliberate movements of someone who had decided long ago that hurrying was rarely worth what it cost. He recognized Mabel. She had been a regular customer for 6 weeks. Mrs. Rourke, he said. Then he looked at Colton, and something in his expression settled. Figured this was going to come around eventually. You know what I'm here about, she said. I know what you're probably here about, Calloway said. He moved to the long counter at the back of the post, with the gait of a man going to do something he'd made up his mind about before they arrived. Pull up a chair. This is going to take some finding. He kept records the way his building was constructed, not organized in any way that made immediate sense, but complete. He found the relevant entries in 40 minutes, which she suspected was faster than his manner implied he was capable of, and laid the ledger open on the counter. She looked at it. September 14th. A purchase of milled cedar posts, 44 of them, and 300 yards of heavy-gauge fencing wire. Delivered to the Double M Ranch on the buyer's instruction, which was Calloway's standard practice for large orders. The buyer was listed as Double M Holdings, Wade Mercer's ranch company. But the delivery address noted in Calloway's cramped, specific hand was not the Double M Ranch. It was a map reference, a canyon coordinate. She looked up at Calloway. You noted the delivery location, she said. Always do for large orders, Calloway said. Man wants me to haul 44 posts somewhere. I need to know where somewhere is. He looked at the ledger. That coordinate puts it in your North Canyon, near as I could work out when I looked at the map. Which wasn't my business, except I made a note of it because it seemed like an odd place to be building something. Would you testify to this? She said. Calloway looked at her, then at Colton, then at Dawson, who had stayed quiet through the entire exchange with the practiced stillness of a man who understood that not speaking was sometimes the most useful thing to do. Mercer's a good customer, Calloway said. She waited. He's also the kind of good customer who makes you feel like being his customer is something he's doing for you, rather than the other way around, Calloway continued. He closed the ledger, then looked up. Yes, I'll testify to it. He slid the ledger across the counter. You can borrow this. I'll want it back. She looked at Ike Calloway, with a feeling she didn't quite have a name for not gratitude exactly, more like the recognition of finding solid ground where she'd expected mud. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, in a way that reminded her of Nora Wick saying the same thing. She was developing a theory that the most useful people in any situation were the ones who didn't want thanks, just results. They reached Redstone Creek by early afternoon, and the judge's situation was not what she had hoped. Judge Harlan was present, a small, deliberate man in his late 60s who had the manner of someone who had heard every kind of argument and retained his skepticism about most of them, but he was not alone. When they were shown into his office, there were already two men present. One was Harlan's clerk. The other was a lawyer named Sims, who worked out of the county seat and whom Mabel had never seen before, but whose presence in the judge's office on this particular morning told her everything she needed to know. Mercer had moved first. Sims was already talking when they came in, and he kept talking for a few seconds after they entered, which was a dominance gesture so transparent that she almost found it useful. He was laying out a framework. She caught enough of it in those first seconds, a framework in which 3 of Mercer's men had been unlawfully detained overnight by a neighboring rancher, following a dispute over stray cattle, and the matter required urgent judicial attention. Judge Harlan looked at Colton, then at Mabel. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. He had met her twice briefly in town. He was one of the people who had not been openly hostile. "This is an interesting morning." "It is," she said. She set Calloway's ledger on his desk. Then she set her own document, the 13 pages she had written over 14 days, the pattern and the dates and the evidence beside it. "I'd like to show you something, if Mr. Sims can spare a moment." Sims looked at the papers on the desk and then at her with the particular expression of a man recalibrating who is in the room. She walked Harlan through it methodically. She did not rush. She did not perform. She laid each piece of evidence beside the next, the way you lay out a map. This is here. This connects to this. This is what it means when you step back and look at the whole. The inventory discrepancies, the fence cut dates cross-referenced against weather records and Colton's absence records. The hidden fence in the canyon, its location, its construction quality, its direction of access. Calloway's ledger with the September purchase and the map coordinate. Pete Dawson's testimony, delivered quietly and precisely by Dawson himself, who described what he had seen in the canyon with the stripped-down economy of a man who understands that a plain statement of fact is harder to argue against than an elaborate one. And then she described the previous night, the 3 riders, the cattle, the direction of movement, and the conversation with the supervisor. Not what he had said, because he had said very little. What he had not said, which was its own kind of testimony. Sims interrupted twice. She let him interrupt, answered the interruptions directly, and returned to where she'd been. When she finished, the room was quiet. Harlan had not moved from behind his desk through the entire presentation. He looked at the papers. He looked at Calloway's ledger. He looked at Sims. "Do you have a response to the physical evidence?" he said to Sims. "Not to the detainment, to the fence purchase and placement." Sims had a response. It was a good response. Technically, he argued that the canyon boundary was not as clearly defined as the Rourke Ranch document suggested, that the fence could have been placed on legitimately contested land, that the coordinate in Calloway's delivery note was approximate and subject to interpretation. She had anticipated this. She took out one additional document, the original land survey she had found in the ranch's deed, records the week before, because she had learned to go looking for things before she needed them rather than after. The survey showed the canyon boundary with a clarity that was not subject to interpretation. The coordinate in Calloway's ledger placed the fence 14 yards inside the Rourke property line. Sims looked at the survey. Then he looked at the window. "Mr. Sims," Harlan said, "I'd like to speak with the men currently detained at the Rourke Ranch. Today, if possible." He looked at Mabel. "Are they available?" "They're at the ranch," she said. "They can be brought to town." "Good." Harlan stood, which appeared to indicate the meeting was over, in the direction Sims had intended it to go. "And I'll want a statement from Mr. Calloway at his convenience." Within the week, Sims gathered his papers with the controlled movements of a man, absorbing a reversal, deciding what to do with it. He looked at Mabel once as he was leaving a flat, professional assessment, without hostility. She held the look until he looked away, and then he was gone. Dawson said quietly. From the corner, "That went better than I expected." "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's better." They rode back to the ranch in the cold afternoon, and the weight of the morning sat on her differently than she'd expected, not lighter, exactly, but more distributed, spread across what had actually been accomplished, rather than concentrated on what still had to happen. Colton rode beside her. Mercer will know by tonight, she said. He already knows, Colton said. Sims will have been in contact with him before he left the judge's office. Then we should expect him to move. In what direction? She thought about it. He's a man who doesn't accept loss gracefully. He's going to want to do something that puts him back in control of the narrative. She paused. He might try to come at us personally. Not physically, that's not how he operates. But he'll try to find something to use. There's nothing to find, Colton said. She looked at him. I know, he said after a moment. That's not the point. The point is he'll manufacture something if he needs to, she said. Or try to. Let him try, she said nothing. She didn't share his certainty, but she also understood that his certainty was not quite as naive as it sounded. It was the certainty of a man who had decided where he stood and was no longer adjusting for a threat. That was its own kind of practical. What she hadn't anticipated was Wade Mercer coming to the ranch himself. He arrived the following morning, alone, no riders, no Sims, no demonstration of force, which told her immediately that this visit was calculated differently than anything that had come before. She saw him from the kitchen window while she was making breakfast, the distinctive gray horse picking its way through the snow-covered yard with the careful steps of an animal not enjoying the cold. She had a moment, just one, where she stood at the window with the skillet in her hand and felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite satisfaction, more like the sharpening that happens before something that matters. Then she put the skillet down and went to the door. Colton was already at the barn. She caught his eye across the yard and held up one hand, one finger, meaning one rider, alone. He nodded, reading it correctly. She stepped onto the porch. Mercer pulled up at the yard's edge and looked at her from the saddle. In the daylight, without the social construction of the town around him, he looked different than she had catalogued him. Still big, still the flat-faced confidence of a man accustomed to rooms accommodating themselves to him. But there was something underneath it this morning. Something she read as the specific anger of a man who has not often been outmaneuvered and is still processing that it has happened. Mrs. Rourke, he said. Mr. Mercer, is your husband here? He's nearby, she said. What can I do for you? He looked at her for a moment. Then he dismounted, because a conversation from horseback with a woman standing on a porch was a conversation he was losing before it started, and he appeared to know it. He tied his horse to the post and came to the foot of the porch steps. He was a large man standing below her, which was not how he was accustomed to standing. I'd like to settle this, he said. Settle what, specifically? The misunderstanding about Mr. Mercer, she said. Her voice was even and not unkind, which she had found was more difficult to argue against than coldness. There isn't a misunderstanding. There's evidence. Judge Harlan has reviewed the better part of it, and he'll be reviewing the rest this week when he speaks to the two men we detained and to Ike Calloway. She paused. If you've come to offer an explanation, I'd suggest saving it for the judge. His jaw tightened. I came to make a practical offer. I'm listening. He named a number. A specific calculated number compensation for the cattle losses, framed as a good faith gesture of neighborly reconciliation. It was enough money to matter, and not enough money to constitute an admission of anything, which told her he had worked it out carefully. She looked at him. No, she said. He blinked. It's not enough, she said. But that's not the reason. She looked at him steadily, and she said the next part carefully, because she had thought about it in the small hours of the morning, and she knew what she meant by it. Money doesn't put the cattle back. Money doesn't give back the winter we spent working against sabotage instead of working for ourselves. And money doesn't do anything about the next man you decide to bleed out when you want his land. Mercer's expression shifted. The calculation underneath his surface was visible for a moment, reassessing, looking for the angle. What do you want? He said. I want you to go to Judge Harlan, she said. I want you to tell him what you told your men to do, in terms that can't be walked back. I want it on record, not a civil settlement with a confidentiality clause, not a check and a handshake. On record. He stopped, looked at her. That's not something any lawyer would advise. No, she agreed, it isn't. And if I don't, then we proceed with what we have, she said, which is enough. He studied her for a long moment. She let him study her. She had learned, in the past several weeks, That holding stillness under examination was one of the more powerful things a person could do, and she had always been better at it than most. You'd push this to a full proceeding, he said, not a question. I've spent a long time in my life being the person everyone assumed would be too tired or too discouraged to follow through, she said. I understand why you'd make that assumption. I'm telling you it's incorrect. Something crossed his face that she had not expected. Not anger, not the recalculation she'd been watching all morning. Something closer to the particular feeling of a man who has made a decision and knows he's going to dislike it. Colton came around from the side of the barn and stopped at the yard's edge, and the three of them occupied the morning air briefly in a silence that held everything that had happened and everything that was coming. Mercer looked at Colton, then back at Mabel. You'd take the confession, he said. Not the money. I want the record, she said. I want Redstone Creek to know what happened. I want the next rancher you look at when you need water rights to already know what you're capable of. That's not legal strategy, Mercer said. That's personal. Yes, she said, it is. Another silence. If I go to Harlan, Mercer said slowly, if I make a statement, I'd want terms. Limited scope. No criminal proceeding, civil record only. That's between you and the judge, she said. I can't make those arrangements. But you wouldn't push for criminal. She thought about it. Not because she hadn't thought about it before, but because she wanted him to see her think about it. Wanted him to understand that this was a decision she was making, not a limitation she was accepting. No, she said. I wouldn't push for criminal. What I want is the record, and what I want is for you to leave Redstone Creek. He stared at her. Leave you have money, she said. You have the double M sell it or keep it and hire a manager. But you leave permanently. She held his gaze. That's what I want instead of money and instead of a criminal proceeding. The record and your absence, that's... He stopped again. His jaw worked once. You're asking me to give up everything I've built here. I'm giving you the choice to do it on your own terms, she said. Which is more than you gave us. The wind moved between them, light now, nothing like the blizzard that felt both recent and ancient. A horse somewhere in the barn shifted and stomped. She waited. Mercer looked at the porch, at the house, at the ranch that sprawled in the white morning around it. She had a feeling he was not looking at the buildings, but at something else, the thing a man sees when he is trying to understand how he arrived somewhere he did not intend to go. He looked at her one more time. She had the impression he was trying to find something in her face, some uncertainty, some room to maneuver, some indication that she would move. She didn't move. I'll go to Harlan, he said. He untied his horse. He mounted without another word. He rode out of the yard without looking back, the gray horse moving steadily through the snow, and she watched him go with her hands at her sides and her face still. Colton came to the porch steps. He didn't say anything immediately, which was characteristic of him and which she had come to value more than she would have predicted. He stood at the foot of the steps and looked at where Mercer had been, and then he looked at her. Personal, he said. Yes, she said, the part about leaving. He tilted his head slightly. That wasn't in the plan. No, she said, I made a different decision. Because money and a record weren't enough. Because a man like that in the same town is a permanent problem, she said. And because she stopped. Tried again. Because what he did wasn't just financial. He decided what we were capable of before he ever met us. He decided this ranch wasn't worth defending because the people in it weren't worth taking seriously. She looked at Colton. I wanted him to have to look at me and understand he was wrong. Colton was quiet for a moment. Did it work? He said. She thought about Mercer's face. The moment she'd identified the specific visible experience of a man understanding he had read a situation entirely incorrectly. Yes, she said. I think it did. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her, and they looked out at the yard and the snow and the mountains emerging white and enormous in the clearing sky. Harlan's going to want a formal statement from you, he said. Probably tomorrow. I know. And Mercer's lawyer is going to try to minimize the scope of whatever record gets made. I know that too. It's not over yet. It's never over, she said. That's not how any of this works. He made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him since the night of the blizzard, not a full laugh, just the brief exhale of a man acknowledging something true. She went back inside to finish making breakfast because the skillet was still on the stove and the morning was still there to be worked through, and whatever had just happened in the yard would have to be enough for now. The formal proceeding before Judge Harlan took place 4 days later. The two detained men had given statements, the broad one, reluctantly, The other, with the resigned cooperation of someone who had decided his loyalty to Mercer was not worth what it was costing. Calloway came down from the North Trading Post with his ledger and gave testimony that was precise and unremarkable and devastating in its specificity. Dawson testified to what he had seen in the canyon. Mercer's statement, given through Sims but in Mercer's own signed words, admitted to directing the fence construction on the Rourke property and authorizing the movement of Rourke cattle as part of what the document carefully called a misguided effort to resolve a long-standing boundary dispute. It was lawyered within an inch of its life, but it was signed and it was on the civil record, and it said what it said. Harlan ordered restitution the full value of the cattle losses, calculated from Mabel's inventory documentation, which was the most precise record in the proceeding, and which everyone in the room knew it. He ordered the fence removed at Mercer's expense. He made the civil record public as she had asked. She sat in the proceeding and listened to all of it with the steady attention she brought to everything that mattered, and when it was done, she was the first one out of the room because she had never been someone who needed to linger in the place where a thing had happened. Nora Wick was outside the judge's office when she came out, which was not an accident. Telegraph, Nora said, handing her a folded paper. Came in this morning, from Calloway. She opened it. It was brief Calloway confirming that the Double M had received an inquiry from a land broker in Denver. Mercer was already making arrangements. She folded the telegram carefully. He's leaving, she said. People talk fast in small towns, Nora said. Will they believe it? They believe what they can see, Nora said. When the Double M hangs a sale sign and Wade Mercer rides out of Redstone Creek, she paused. They'll believe it. Mabel looked down the main street of Redstone Creek at the storefronts and the people moving between them. Clara Benton was visible outside the bank, talking to another woman, and she saw the moment Clara registered her presence, the slight pause, the recalibration, something unfamiliar moving through Clara's expression. Not respect, exactly. Not yet. But the beginning of the reassessment that precedes it. She looked at it for one moment, and then she looked away. Because she had not done any of this for Clara Benton's opinion, or the town's opinion, or for any approval beyond the practical. The ranch was intact. The record was made. The man who had tried to take it was leaving. Colton came out behind her and stood beside her on the step. She handed him the telegram. He read it, looked up. The winter light came flat and cold across the main street, turning everything the same pale color, and the mountains to the north were sharp and white against the sky. All right, he said. All right, she said. They walked back to where the horses were tied, and she fell into step beside him naturally, without thought, and if the town watched them go, it was their business to watch, and hers to keep walking, which was what she did. The Double M hung its sale sign in January. She saw it herself, on a supply run to Calloway's trading post, not the sign itself, which was nailed to a gate 20 miles south of the North Road, but the confirmation of it in Calloway's expression when she walked in, the slight widening of his eyes that meant he'd already heard and was gauging whether she had. It's done then, he said. Apparently, she said. She bought her supplies and rode back to the ranch in the hard winter light, and she did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected something clean relief, or the satisfaction of a completed thing. What she felt instead was more complicated and less comfortable, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been running at full capacity for months and has not yet been given permission to stop. The ranch needed her at full capacity for at least another 6 weeks. Winter didn't care about legal proceedings or signed documents or men who were making arrangements with Denver land brokers. Cattle needed feeding. The water lines needed monitoring. The fence repairs that had been deferred through the worst of the emergency now needed to be addressed before the spring the pastures into something unmanageable. She came home and put the supplies away, stood at the kitchen window for exactly as long as it took to drink a cup of coffee, and then she went back to work. That was December. January passed in the way of deep winter months slowly, and all at once the days short and the work long, the cold a constant background condition that stopped being remarkable and started being simply the medium in which everything happened. She developed the rhythms she had been building toward since October, the specific efficiency of a person who has learned a place well enough to stop thinking about each action separately and start thinking in patterns. Gustavo's hands had recovered from the frostbite of the blizzard night, which had been her quiet worry through December. She had checked them without making a production of checking them. and watched him work, and only when she was certain he had full grip strength back did she stop monitoring it. He had not said anything about the monitoring. She had not said anything about stopping it. That was how things worked between them by then. Holt had changed in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. The boy who had arrived at the canyon on that blizzard night as someone trying to prove something had come out of it as someone who had already proved it and was now simply working. The anxious quality was mostly gone. What replaced it was quieter and more useful, a young man paying attention to the right things, asking better questions, making decisions within his scope rather than waiting for someone to make them for him. She told Colton about it, one evening, obliquely, the way she tended to raise personnel observations, not as assessments, but as information. Holt's going to be valuable in the spring drive, she said. Colton looked up from the ledger. I know, he said. I've been thinking the same thing. He should be given more responsibility. Not all at once, agreed. Colton paused. You've been watching all of them. That's my job, she said. It wasn't in the letter, he said. The job description. What was in the letter was that you needed someone who would still be standing when things got hard, she said. Took that to include everyone on the property. He looked at her for a moment, the same way he had looked at her in the canyon before they rode down, and in the yard after Mercer left, and across the kitchen table on more ordinary evenings than she could now easily count. The look that said he was seeing something he had not seen before, even though it had been there all along. Yes, he said. I suppose it did. It was in February that the town began to shift. Not dramatically. Not with any announcement or collective decision. It moved the way opinion moves in small places gradually, and then suddenly, through the accumulation of small revisions, each one barely noticeable on its own. The first evidence was Haverford. She had been routing her supply orders around him since October out of practical necessity rather than any sustained grievance, and Haverford had watched this happen with the expression of a man who knows he is losing something but can't quite admit why. In February, he stopped her on the street outside his store. Mrs. Rourke, he said. He was holding his hat in a way that signaled he was about to say something he had been working up to for a while. He stopped. Tried again. I had an arrangement with Mercer. I want you to know I understood what that arrangement was, and I understand how it looked. She waited. I'd like to have your business back, he said, if you'd consider it. She looked at him for a moment. He was a man of about 50, with a business that depended on the goodwill of the community around him. And the community around him had been watching what happened to Wade Mercer very carefully. I'll consider it, she said, not warmly, not coldly, practically. He nodded and replaced his hat and went back inside, and she walked on and turned the consideration over in her mind, the way she turned most things not with emotion, but with the question of what was useful. She told Colton about it at dinner. Haverford, he said. Yes. What are you going to do? I'm going to give him a small order next month, she said. See how it goes. And if he's straight with you, then we have a supplier in town again, which is useful, and he knows exactly why he has to be straight with me, which is also useful. Colton almost smiled. Almost. You don't trust him, he said. I trust him to understand where his interests are, she said. That's enough. Clara Benton was a more complicated situation. Clara did not come to Mabel directly. That was not how Clara operated, and Mabel had never expected it. What happened instead was that Clara's particular social weather began to point in a different direction. The observations that had once been edged with the implicit suggestion that Mabel was not quite adequate began to carry a different undertone, something closer to the careful repositioning of a woman who has been on the wrong side of an outcome and is deciding how to acknowledge this without admitting it directly. Mabel observed this process without feeling much about it. She had never wanted Clara Benton's approval, and she didn't want her revised version of it either. What she wanted was to be left to work, which Clara's repositioning did in fact accomplish, which was what mattered. It was Nora Wick who gave her the most direct account of what was moving through the town's understanding. People are talking about the canyon, Nora said, one afternoon at the telegraph office without preamble. The full story is out now. Calloway's been telling it at the Trading Post, and you know how that travels. I didn't ask Calloway to tell it, Mabel said. I know, Nora said. Calloway does what Calloway does. The point is that people understand now what was happening to the ranch, and they understand who stopped it. She looked at Mabel directly. Some of them are uncomfortable with that. Why? Because they laughed at you in the street in October, Nora said. And now they have to figure out what to do with that. Mabel was quiet for a moment. That's their business, she said. Yes, Nora agreed. But it's also yours, whether you want it to be or not. That's how towns work. She leaned against the counter. What I'm telling you is that the ground has shifted. How you walk on it from here matters. I'm not interested in punishing anyone, Mabel said. I know, Nora said. That's exactly what I mean. She thought about that conversation for several days afterward, turning it alongside everything else she was carrying. She was not a person who spent much time on what she was owed. She had learned young that the accounting of what people owed her was a ledger that never balanced and drained energy she needed for other things. But she was also not someone who pretended injuries hadn't happened, which was its own kind of dishonesty. What she kept coming back to was this. The people who had laughed at her on that first street corner in October had done so because they had already decided what she was before she opened her mouth. They had looked at her body and her carpet bag and her single good dress, and they had written the whole story without asking her a single question. She had spent 31 years living inside other people's stories about her. She had been her father's disappointment and her sister's charity case and the Abilene widower's inconvenient employee. She had been the mail-order bride the town of Redstone Creek had already consigned to failure before she stepped off the stage. The things she had learned not in Redstone Creek, but long before in the long schooling of a life spent being underestimated, was that you could not argue your way out of those stories. You could not convince anyone by explaining yourself. The only way out was through. You did the work, you held the line, you stayed standing when the thing came that was supposed to knock you down, and eventually the story the world had written about you collided with the evidence of who you actually were, and one of them had to give. Redstone Creek's story had given. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt tired in the way of someone who has been fighting a current and has finally reached the bank, not exhilarated, just grateful for solid ground and aware that the river is still there. The town gathering happened in late March, when the worst of the winter had finally eased and the valley was beginning the slow, muddy, unbeautiful process of becoming spring. It was organized by a man named Aldous Webb, who ran the feed store and served on some informal civic committee that organized the things the town did, collectively the harvest gathering in autumn, the spring gathering that marked the turn of the season, the occasional meeting when something needed to be decided publicly. Webb was a quiet, steady man who had said nothing to Mabel in either direction through the whole of the fall and winter, which she had read as neutrality rather than hostility and been largely right about. He came to the ranch to extend the invitation himself, which she understood immediately was the point, not the invitation, but the coming. The town would like to see the Rourkes at the gathering, he said, standing at the porch with his hat in his hands. Both of you. A pause. I want you to know that's my sentiment, and not just a formality. She looked at him. We'll be there, she said. Colton, who had come to the door behind her, said nothing. He said nothing until Webb had ridden away, and then he said, You didn't ask me. Would you have said no? A pause. Then I didn't need to ask, she said. But I should have. She looked at him. I'm sorry. He seemed mildly surprised by the apology, not because it was unexpected from her, but because she had made it so quickly and without the defensive scaffolding that apologies sometimes carry. It's all right, he said. It's a habit, she said. Making decisions alone. I'm working on it. He looked at her for a moment. So am I, he said. Different habit. Same direction. She understood what he meant. He had been working through the winter on the habit of bringing her into decisions earlier, not because she required it, but because he had seen, in that first season, what happened when two people on the same property were working from different information. The Canyon night had been the clearest demonstration of what could be accomplished when they weren't. They were not an easy partnership. She wanted that on record, even if only to herself they disagreed, sometimes sharply, on questions of pacing and risk and resource allocation. And Colton has a stubbornness that was both one of his most valuable qualities and one of his most frustrating ones, a difficulty with reversing a position even when the evidence for reversal was clear. She had her own version of the same problem, a tendency to move faster than the people around her could follow, to have arrived at a conclusion before anyone else had been invited to the reasoning, which created a particular kind of friction she was still learning to manage. But what they had built in 6 months was something she had not fully expected when she stepped off that stage in October. A working partnership between two people who respected each other's competence without idealizing each other's character, which was rarer than it had any right to be, and worth more than she had known to want. She wore her better dress to the gathering, the dark green wool, the same one she'd worn on her first morning in Redstone Creek, because she was not a woman who went in for symbolism, particularly, but she was also not a woman who missed a good opportunity. The gathering was held in the large barn attached to Webb's feed store, which had been cleared and laid with plank tables and lit with oil lamps in a way that made it almost warm, almost comfortable. The rough edges of an ordinary working building softened just enough by occasion. Most of Redstone Creek was there she had not understood until she walked in how many people constituted most of Redstone Creek, how the town was larger than its main street suggested, extended into the surrounding homesteads and small ranches and operations she had not yet fully cataloged. She walked in beside Colton, and she felt the room adjust not in the hostile, distancing way of October, but something different. The ripple that moves through a space when the people in it are reassessing, quietly and individually, the thing they're looking at. Pete Dawson found them early and shook Colton's hand, and then without hesitation shook hers. She appreciated the without hesitation. Gustavo was there with his wife, a small dark woman named Petra, whom Mabel had met twice at the ranch and liked immediately, because Petra had the particular quality of a woman who had spent years watching her husband deal with difficult things, and had developed through that a precise and unsentimental eye for character. Petra had looked at Mabel in their first meeting and said, "Gustavo tells me you saved the cattle." And Mabel had said, "We saved the cattle." And Petra had nodded in a way that meant she had heard both things Mabel was saying. Holt arrived with a young woman whom he introduced with the slightly flustered formality of a man who has brought someone to meet people whose opinion matters to him, and Mabel was careful with her manner. For this reason, because the young woman looked nervous, and the nervousness was clearly not about Mabel specifically, but about the general terror of being presented in public, which Mabel understood from the inside in a way that made her careful. The food was communal, everyone had brought something, and she ate with the specific gratitude of a woman who had been cooking for a working ranch for 6 months and was relieved for one evening to eat someone else's decisions. It was later in the evening, when the formality had loosened, and people were moving between tables, and the conversation had risen to the comfortable noise of a room full of people who know each other, that the thing happened which she had not expected. She was standing near the far wall, watching the room, holding a cup she had forgotten was empty, when a woman she didn't know came and stood beside her. Not young, somewhere in her 60s, with the weathered look of someone who had worked outside for most of her life, and an expression that was direct without being aggressive. "Mrs. Rourke," she said. "Yes," Mabel said. "I'm Eleanor Pruitt. I have a homestead 8 miles east." She paused. "I heard about the canyon." "About what you did." "We did," Mabel said by reflex. "What you built?" Eleanor Pruitt said firmly, not accepting the deflection. "The evidence. The document. The plan." Mabel looked at her. "I have a problem," Eleanor Pruitt said. "My water rights. There's a man who's been filing claims against my northeast edge for 2 years. Small claims, nothing dramatic, but they add up, and I don't have." She stopped. "Reorganized. I don't know how to fight it the way you fought Mercer. I don't have that kind of mind for documents and records." The room moved around them, loud and warm. "What records do you have?" Mabel said. "My original deed. Some correspondence. Receipts from the county surveyor from when I first filed." "That might be enough," Mabel said. "It depends on what he's claiming and what your deed actually says." She paused. "Bring them to me. I'll look at them." Eleanor Pruitt looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had prepared themselves for a different kind of answer. "Just like that," she said. "Yes," Mabel said. "Just like that." She did not make a speech about it. She did not attach conditions or caveats or expectations. Eleanor Pruitt nodded, and they talked for a few more minutes about the specifics, and then they were absorbed back into the evening, and Mabel went to find Colton. She found him talking to Webb near the door, a conversation that appeared to be about spring road conditions and the general state of the North Valley fence lines, which was a useful conversation in which she joined briefly before Webb moved on to someone else. "Eleanor Pruitt," Colton said when they were briefly alone. "You saw I see most things," he said, "just slower than you. She has a water rights problem. I'm going to look at her documents." He was quiet for a moment. "You know that if you do this for her, There'll be others, he said. Not as a warning, as a fact. I know, she said. The ranch already takes. I know, she said. I'll manage the time. She looked at him. I spent 31 years being a person who kept her head down and hoped that being useful in the places she was allowed to be useful would be enough. She paused. And what she felt in that moment was something she rarely acknowledged even to herself, a kind of grief for the years she'd spent small, spent fitting herself into spaces other people had decided she deserved. I'm done with that. Colton held her gaze. All right, he said. You're not going to argue. Would it matter? No, she said honestly. Then I'll save us both the time. He looked at the room around them, the gathered town, the lamplight, the noise of people in a warm space after a long winter. There's some things I want to say. I've been trying to find the right time, which is not something I'm good at. She waited. When I placed that advertisement, he said, I was looking for a practical arrangement. Someone to keep the house and help with the accounts and survive the winters. He looked at his cup. I wrote that letter about wanting someone who'd still be standing when things got hard. And I meant it, but I meant it practically. The way you mean a fence needs to hold. I know, she said. I didn't mean. He stopped. Colton Rourke was a man who had spent years communicating in action rather than language, and this was visible, the effortful translation happening in real time. I didn't understand what I was actually asking for, what that would look like in a real person. She looked at him steadily. I see you now, he said. Not the arrangement, you. The room was loud around them, and nobody was paying attention to the two of them, standing near the back wall, and she was glad of that because she was not certain what was on her face. She had told herself, in those first weeks in the hotel room on the first night, on the drive out to the ranch, in the ledger pages and the fence inspections and the hard practical work of building something in a place that hadn't wanted her, that she was not looking for that. The look, the recognition. She had told herself the practical arrangement was enough, that she was a practical person, and practical arrangements were what practical people needed. She had been, she now understood, lying to herself in the kindly necessary way of people who are protecting themselves from a hope they don't trust. I see you too, she said. It was the plainest thing she had said to him in 6 months. It was also the truest. He did not reach for her hand or make any gesture that would have called attention to the two of them in the middle of a crowded gathering, which she appreciated, because she was not a woman who wanted her private moments witnessed. But something settled between them, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical weight that the feeling deserved, just quietly, the way the best things settle, like a fence post set properly, like ground that holds. The gathering ended the way those things end gradually, people peeling away in ones and twos, the lamps burning lower, the conversations winding to the comfortable conclusion of people who know they'll see each other again. She and Colton rode back to the ranch in the clear, cold March night, not talking much, which was its own kind of language by now. Spring came in the way of that country reluctantly, at first, with mud and false starts and cold snaps that made everyone feel cheated, and then suddenly and completely, the way a decision gets made after a long time considering it. The snow retreated to the mountain peaks and stayed there. Pastures came back. The creek that ran through the north edge of the property, the one that Mercer had wanted badly enough to commit to ruin for it, ran full and cold and entirely theirs. She expanded the supply route in April, a formal arrangement with Callaway's trading post that gave her access to better pricing through volume, and a secondary arrangement with a freighter out of the county seat who could bring specialty supplies on a monthly schedule. She tracked the ranch's finances with the same 13-page methodology she'd developed in the fall, updated now and refined and extended into a forward-looking model that could tell her 6 weeks out what they would need and what it would cost. Colton went to her with the finances now, rather than her going to him. This had happened gradually, without being declared. The way most of the real changes between them happened through practice rather than agreement. Daily accretion of small decisions that added up to something neither of them had formally named. Eleanor Pruitt came with her documents in April, as she'd said she would. The water rights situation was exactly as complex as Mabel had suspected, and slightly more solvable than Eleanor had feared. She spent 2 evenings with the documents and produced a counter-filing strategy that she walked Eleanor through at the kitchen table, slowly twice, until Eleanor understood not just what to do but why. Eleanor was 63 years old, had homesteaded her land alone after her husband died of a fever. 12 years earlier, and had a particular quality that Mabel recognized from the inside, the hard-won steadiness of a woman who has survived long enough alone that survival has become her primary skill and her deepest identity, and who is sometimes surprised to discover there are people willing to help her without wanting something in return. "What do I owe you?" Eleanor said when they were done. "Nothing," Mabel said. "That's not how." "You'll help someone else when you can," Mabel said. "That's what you owe." Eleanor looked at her. Then she nodded once, and that was that. The others came through spring and into early summer. Not in large numbers, this was not a thing that announced itself with fanfare, but steadily, in the particular way of word, traveling through a community that has decided something. A young homesteader with a disputed fence line, a widow with a contested inheritance, a man whose supply arrangement with the county had language in it that he didn't understand and suspected was cheating him, because it was. She handled each one at the kitchen table in the evenings after the ranch work was done. She handled them with the same methodical approach she had brought to Calloway's ledger and Mercer's fence and her own ranch's inventory. Look at what is actually there, not what people are assuming is there. Find the specific thing that needs to be addressed. Address it without adding more drama than the situation already contains. Colton watched this happen and said nothing, which was his version of approval, and she accepted it as such. It was Holt who finally said what several people had apparently been thinking. He found her at the fence line one afternoon in June, checking a section that had been problematic through the spring thaw, and he stood there for a moment, with his hat in his hands in the way he had when he was working up to something. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. "Holt, people are calling you?" He stopped. "Not people exactly. Some people. What are they calling me?" "The woman who runs Redstone Creek," he said. Not meaning it bad. Meaning he tried to find the word. The person people go to now. For things, she looked at the fence line. "I don't run anything," she said. "I know that," he said. "But you know what I mean." She did know what he meant. She had been aware of it, building through the spring, the shift in how people in town held themselves when she walked through, the quality of the attention that followed her, which had changed from the hostile appraisal of October to something else. Not reverence. She would have found reverence unbearable. More like the practical, unglamorous acknowledgement of competence that communities extend to the people who have proven, over time, that they understand something about the territory that others don't. "How do you feel about it?" Holt said. She looked at him. "The job you signed on for," he said, gesturing vaguely at the fence line, "the ranch, the whole practical business of the life she had built here. And then all the other things. Is it," he searched, "is it what you wanted when you came here?" She thought about October. The stage dropping her at the edge of Redstone Creek with a carpet bag and the sound of laughter rising to meet her. The hotel room and the window and the women in pressed dresses and the decision she had made, not the dramatic kind of decision, not the kind that comes with clarity and conviction, but the scraping, tired, stubborn kind. The kind that says, "I have nothing to lose, so I might as well go forward." She thought about the ledger pages, the 13-page document she had built in 2 weeks in a cold kitchen by lamplight, while the man she was married to slept down the hall, the ridge above the canyon in a blizzard, Mercer's face in the yard when he understood she wasn't going to move, Eleanor Pruitt's document spread across the kitchen table. "I wanted to be useful," she said, "and to not be in a room where I didn't belong." She paused. "I didn't know what that would look like. Does it look like you thought it would?" She considered the question honestly. "It looks like more work than I imagined," she said. "And less loneliness." Holt nodded slowly, processing this in the way of young people receiving information they'll need in 10 years. "That's good, right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It's good." He put his hat back on and went back to the fence inspection, and she stayed where she was for a moment, looking out at the valley, the creek visible as a line of green in the brown gold of the summer pasture, the mountains white-tipped at their peaks, the ranch buildings small and solid in the middle distance. This was not a beautiful country in the easy way of places built to be looked at. It was beautiful in the way of things that are built to endure functional, undecorated, structured for the reality of what it actually had to bear. The beauty was in the holding, the staying, the daily work of maintenance that kept something alive through conditions that wanted it dead. She had spent 6 months learning that. She expected to spend the rest of her life practicing it. The summer gathering was Webb's idea again. A smaller thing than the spring one, more informal, a communal meal at the edge of town on a warm July evening, with tables set outside and children running through them in the way children run when they've been cold for months and are now finally desperately free. She was standing at one of the tables, talking to Pete Dawson about the spring cattle market, practical talk, useful talk, kind of conversation she had come to understand was one of the primary ways people in this country actually communicated what they thought about things. When she became aware that a group of people had gathered a few feet away, not a crowd, 4 or 5, including Clara Benton, which she registered with the particular internal preparation that Clara Benton always required, and Webb, and a woman named Harriet Cole who ran the boarding house and had spoken to Mabel twice in a neutral, careful way that she had read as a woman withholding judgment until she had enough information. Clara spoke first, which was characteristic. Mrs. Rourke, she said. I wonder if I might ask you something. You can ask, Mabel said. The Cole family, Harriet's family, has a boundary dispute coming up before the county commissioner next month. Clara paused, and the pause had something in it that Mabel had never heard from Clara before. The specific hesitation of a woman who is asking for help and is not accustomed to being in that position. We were wondering whether you might look at the documents. Mabel looked at Clara Benton. She looked at the woman who had, on her first day in Redstone Creek, turned to another woman and said she'll break the poor man's horse just climbing into the saddle, loud enough for the street to hear. Who had spent the fall planting social seeds designed to make Mabel feel that her presence here was an imposition and an embarrassment. She let herself feel what she felt about that, all of it. The full weight of the memory, the specific hurt of those first days, the energy spent in those first months, knowing that Clara's voice was working against her in rooms she wasn't in. She let herself feel it, and then she set it down. Bring me the documents, she said. I'll look at them. Clara blinked. She had apparently prepared for several possible answers. This was not among them. Just like that, Clara said. And Mabel understood, hearing those words in Clara's voice, that Eleanor Pruitt had asked the same question, in the same surprised tone, 4 months earlier at the kitchen table. She understood that this was going to be asked of her for a long time, by people who had expected the world to be a transaction, and were confused by the absence of one. Yes, she said. Just like that. She did not explain why. She did not offer the speech about what had been done to her and the deliberate choice she was making to do otherwise. That was her business, not Clara's, and Clara would either understand it in time or she wouldn't. What mattered was that she had made the choice herself, for her own reasons, from strength, rather than from the desperate need to make everyone comfortable that had governed so much of her life before Redstone Creek. She was helping Clara Benton because she had decided to, not because she was afraid not to. The difference between those two things was the whole of it. Later in the evening, when the gathering had wound into the comfortable late hours, and the children had been collected, and the conversations had gone soft with tiredness and summer warmth, Colton found her at the edge of the firelight, looking at the mountains. He stood beside her without speaking, which was how they often existed in the same space together, without needing to be doing the same thing. Clara Benton asked me to look at a document, she said. I heard, he said. You'll hear more like that. I know, he said. She looked at the mountains. The peaks were visible in the last light, holding the shape of the day against the coming dark. I have something I want to say, she said. All right. When I came here, I was 31 years old. I had a carpet bag and a dress I'd worn too many times, and no real plan beyond not going backward, she said. I thought the best I could hope for was something functional, something that would hold. She paused. I want you to know that what this has become, she stopped. Tried again, because she was not practiced at this, and she was not going to pretend she was. I didn't know I was allowed to want this, the whole of it. I didn't know it was available to someone like me. Colton turned to look at her. Someone like you, he said quietly. Not repeating it to argue with it, repeating it to look at it. I was the woman nobody wanted, she said. That was the story. I had it so long, I stopped questioning whether it was true. And now, he said, she thought about Redstone Creek in October, and the laughter, and the hotel room, and the ledger pages, and the blizzard, and the canyon, and Eleanor Pruitt's documents, and Clara Benton's surprise, and the way Holt had put his hat back on and gone back to work as though what she had said was the most ordinary thing in the world. She thought about Colton's voice in the barn on the morning of the storm, saying, "You're with me," and what she had felt about those two words. Now I know the story was wrong, she said. and I know it's not going to be told again." He reached out and took her hand. Not the dramatic gesture of a romantic hero, just a man, standing at the edge of a fire in the mountains, taking the hand of the person beside him. Practical and deliberate and entirely sincere, she let him hold it. Around them, Redstone Creek went about its evening. Children called out from somewhere in the dark. A horse stamped near the hitching post. Webb and Dawson argued amiably about something that would be resolved in exactly the same way the following year. The fire crackled in the way of fires that have been built right, that have enough air and enough fuel, and will hold through the night if you let them. She had walked into this town with nothing but what she could carry. She stood in it now with the cattle in the north pasture, and the water rights secured, and the evidence on record, and Eleanor Pruitt's problem moving toward resolution, and Harriet Cole's documents on their way to her kitchen table, and Holt learning to work properly, and Gustavo's hands healed, and the fence lines sound. She stood in it with this man's hand in hers, and the knowledge not comfortable, not simple, not free from the ordinary friction of two difficult people, trying to build something together, that she was in the right place, doing the right work, living the life she had not known she was allowed to ask for. Out here she had come to understand. Strength was not what you looked like. It was not the thing you could demonstrate in a single moment, or a single act, or a single night in a canyon in a blizzard. It was the thing you rebuilt every morning when you got up and did the work again imperfectly, with yesterday's mistakes still in the ledger, with tomorrow's problems not yet clear. It was the choosing to stay, the choosing to see what was actually there, rather than what was easier to assume. The choosing to extend a hand to Eleanor Pruitt, and then to the homesteader, and then to the widow, and then to Clara Benton, not because any of them deserved it in the accounting sense, but because that was who she had decided to be, in the place she had decided to be at. The woman the town had called nobody's bride was standing at the center of it now, not because the town had finally granted her the right to stand there, but because she had never in the end needed them to. That was the whole of it. That was everything. The fire held through the night, and so did she.